Hello, I am Martin Debattista, and for the next few minutes I will deliver a short talk about Malta during the Second World War, upon the invitation of the Malta University Historical Society. In 2020, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary from the end of the Second World War. And for this reason, I have decided to concentrate on Malta during this very important event in world history, but I would like to give you some new insights on this very important period for the history of Malta. If we go back to the start of the Second World War in 1939, we're going to realize that Malta was already in the thick of the political intrigues regarding the Second World War and what happened, what were the events that actually led to this global conflagration. If we go a few years back before 1939, in the mid to late 1930s, we see a situation where Malta was a British colony, but Malta as a British colony was very much near fascist Italy in terms of geographical positioning. And at that time, the Italian fascist Benito Mussolini wanted to create a sphere of influence in the Mediterranean and exclude all other powers. He would talk about Mare Nostrum, our sea, and therefore, if Italy wanted to go back to the glory of the Roman Empire, the classical Roman Empire, and have the Mediterranean all for itself, then the British bases in Gibraltar, Malta, and Egypt would pose a very serious problem. And things precipitated after the 1935 crisis in Abyssinia, that is when Italy invaded this small country, Abyssinia, today known as Ethiopia, and sanctions were imposed on Italy. And Britain took a very strong position against Italy, and at one point there was even talk of the possibility of war erupting between Britain and Italy. This obviously would have had an effect on Malta, which is only 90 kilometers away from Italian territory, from Sicily, and therefore preparations were started in Malta to make ready for an eventual possible attack from Italy. And indeed, Malta was one of the first British colonies and territories outside the United Kingdom to have an air raid precaution system, and people were being trained in getting ready for possible attacks from the air. And at the time, the attacks were expected to be gas attacks, not bombs being thrown over the Maltese towns and cities and villages and military installations. But what was the main reason that actually led the British to fear most Italian ambitions? In fact, Italy, fascist Italy, had a direct ambition over Malta because fascist Italy regarded Malta as being Italian, as being a terra redenta, that is, Italian territory that needed to be freed and assimilated back within the Italian sovereign state. And therefore there was this clash between the Italian ambitions and obviously the British ambitions, who regarded Malta as a very important naval base in the chain of bases that would go from the United Kingdom right through the Mediterranean and on the way to the rest of the British Empire. And therefore the sparks that started flying obviously had repercussions on Malta. We also need to remember that at the time there was a sizable and very important element in the Maltese population that were pro-Italian, that is, they favored Italian culture. Indeed, their first language was not Maltese but Italian. These included the nobility, some people in the professional middle classes, and also some exponents of the political class, especially the Nationalist Party. And for this reason, these people were being targeted not just by the British government in Malta, but also elements of this press, especially the press of the Stricklandian party. They were being branded as being traitors, as being Quislings. The term Quisling came from Vidkun Quisling, who was the Norwegian who actually helped the Germans when the Germans invaded Norway in April 1940. So what happened is that with the declaration of war in 1939 between Britain, France and Germany, nothing happened in the Mediterranean because Italy stayed neutral. But then in June 1940, exactly on the 10th of June, Mussolini announced that Italy had declared war on Britain and France. And we're going to see the importance of this declaration and the context in the following clip.
Combattenti di terra, di mare, dell'aria, camicie nere della rivoluzione e delle legioni, uomini e donne d'Italia, dell'impero e del regno d'Abaria, ascoltate. La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia.
So we've seen how the Italians wanted to declare war, but as we can see from the placards that were in the crowd that was cheering this declaration of war, there was Malta. Indeed, Italy wanted to take Malta, but not by force. So the Italian strategy in June 1940 was not a military attack, but rather to attack Malta from the air, have some raids, and then wait for Britain to surrender to Germany. Remember, at the time in June 1940, the situation was very dangerous for the British. They had to actually evacuate their army from Dunkirk in France back into Britain. And Germany had conquered almost all Europe. And the next phase was the famous Battle of Britain, where Germany was planning to invade Britain. And so Mussolini wanted to wait for Britain to surrender to Germany and then take Malta and the other territories like Corsica and Tunisia over the negotiation table rather than a full all-out military invasion. One very important aspect of the time is, despite the British saying that Malta was a very important naval base for them, in fact in 1940 Malta was not able to defend itself. Although Malta should have had at least 4 squadrons of modern Hurricane fighters and many more soldiers than it actually had, and many more anti-aircraft guns than it actually had, while the propaganda in the newspapers was writing about how Malta was invincible, in reality the situation in Malta was very much different. And in fact, if we were to see what happened in June after the first raids, the instructions were for people to stay at home, because the government in Malta was very much aware that if there was a lot of panic in the streets, it would hinder the military operations. And they thought that the Maltese limestone was strong enough to withstand bombs, but more importantly, Malta had been prepared to withstand an attack by gas from the air. There were no dugout shelters. The only shelters were actually some of the tunnels that were built by the Knights many centuries before, the railway tunnels, and people were actually told to stay inside in homes, go under the table or go under the stairs. Malta had only food supplies for a couple of months, despite the reassurances of the government in Malta, and around a third of the local population was evacuated from localities around Grand Harbour, further away of the military installations around the harbour. So while the British authorities and the newspapers were telling the Maltese to stay calm because we were prepared and we were invincible, in his writings, the governor of Malta, General William Dobbie, in fact, he admits that, and I'm quoting from his book, our Air Force in Malta was a makeshift affair. So far as anti-aircraft guns were concerned, we were nearly as badly off. Our defenses were hopelessly defective. As regards to the danger of invasion, our other resources to meet it were also thoroughly inadequate. We were so weak, a fact of which Italy was fully aware. So this is June 1940. We were weak, but the invasion did not come. And we know the reason why it did not come. The Italians were not prepared to do a military invasion. Here we have another quotation from Francesco Pricolo, who was the chief of the Regia Aeronautica, who in his diary in 1940 wrote, he, Mussolini, was perfectly informed on the state of readiness and efficiency of our armed forces. The optimistic valuation was unfortunately fatal for the general conduct of our war, and, as we shall see, led to disastrous consequences. So, even though Italy entered in the war on the side of the Germans, Italy was not militarily prepared to wage war. And we would see these negative predisposition later on in the war when Italy was actually beaten by the Allies. So, Malta's unpreparedness did not go unnoticed, and one of the most important figures in Britain, that is Prime Minister Winston Churchill, immediately took measures to reinforce Malta, and in fact, by August 1940, the first reinforcements started coming to Malta in terms of fighter planes and in terms of soldiers. And this is what Prime Minister Churchill wrote to the governor of Malta in 1941 and in 1940. Reinforcements should be carried into Malta, which I consider to be in grievous danger at present time. This was in October 1940. And in 1941, Churchill reassured Governor Dobbie, you may be sure we regard Malta as one of the master keys of the British Empire. We are sure that you are the man to hold it, and we will do everything in our power to give you the means. And in fact, the means to defend Malta came, and not just to defend Malta, but also for Malta to go onto the offensive. Why? Because Malta was in a very strategic position between Italy and North Africa to go on the offensive and attack the convoys with supplies that the Italians were sending to North Africa. And in this map we can see that not only Royal Navy could operate from Malta, but also attack bombers and attack aircraft from Malta could easily attack all the convoys, all the ships that were sailing from Italian harbors onto North Africa. And in here, for example, we see how easy for the British was to intercept these convoys, the blue line that were coming from Italy to reinforce the Italians in North Africa, which at the time were involved in battle with the British who were based in Egypt. This is the conclusion of one prominent Italian historian, Nicola Malizia, who wrote and researched a lot about Italy in the Second World War and the role of Malta in this war. And he comes to the conclusion that Malta was, unfortunately, the biggest mistake in the Italian war, equal to that of Germany failing to invade Britain immediately after the debacle at Dunkirk. So, the failure of the Italians and the Germans eventually to invade and take over Malta would prove fatal for the Axis strategy, because Malta would go on to prove to be a thorn in the side of the Germans and the Italians for the Battle of North Africa. Here in this table we see a comparison between the Battle of Britain and the Air Battle of Malta, because essentially Malta was under siege But it was an air battle. There was no land battle in Malta because Malta was not invaded. So the battle were around Malta, in the waters around Malta, and especially in the air. And here we have a comparison which was summed up by an unnamed British fighter pilot who says that the air battle of Malta makes the Battle of Britain and fighter sweeps seem like child's play in comparison, because the British and Commonwealth fighter pilots who fought in Malta were under constant bombardment. They had to suffer the hunger like the Maltese in 1942, which wasn't the case during the Battle of Britain, because during the Battle of Britain, the British airfields were only under attack for a few days and not for 2 years as in Malta. And then here, this is a tribute to the British and Commonwealth pilots who fought in Malta. And with Commonwealth pilots, I have to stress that the most successful pilots, especially the Spitfire pilots in Malta in 1942, were not British. They were mainly Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and there were also others from South Africa, from Rhodesia, and also Americans. So it was not only the British and the English who defended Malta. The propaganda during the war continued. The Italians continued to tell the world that they were subduing Malta as a naval base, and in Malta, the war also involved the civilians. And in this cartoon, published on the Times of Malta on the 17th of May 1942, at the height of the battle for Malta, we see that the civilians are actually joining the ranks with the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. And together, the four of them, they are fighting on to victory. In this cartoon, we see how the Germans tried to wipe out Malta, especially during March and April 1942, and yet they did not achieve their aims. And in this cartoon of the Daily Express, actually is a tribute to Malta, because it shows that despite the efforts, the Germans did not subdue Malta, and in May 1942, they turned their effort not on Malta, but back to the Soviet front, and therefore the chance to invade Malta in June and July 1942 was lost. And in fact, what happens is that in May 1942 we see the tide turning, because Malta received enough reinforcements of Spitfire fighter aircraft, and these that came especially in May actually made possible for the defense of Malta. And the remaining question was not whether Malta could defend itself in military terms, but whether Malta could receive enough supplies in terms of armaments, in terms of ammunition, fuel, and more importantly, food to keep on fighting. And this actually led to the famous Operation Pedestal, the Santa Maria convoy, which brought enough supplies in August 1942 so that Malta could keep on fighting. And in this picture, a very famous picture of the American tanker Ohio, in it had a very precious cargo of fuel, which enabled the British fighters in Malta and the military machine in Malta to continue to fight until 1943, when actually the fight was taken to Sicily and Italy surrendered. In this graphic, we see the Operation Pedestal, the Santa Maria convoy. Only 5 out of 14 merchantmen arrived in Malta, but they were enough for Malta to continue the fight. And when they continued the fight, it made it possible for the British and Commonwealth forces to defeat Field Marshal Rommel, the Germans and the Italians in the Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942. Then the British and the Americans invaded North Africa in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942, and the Axis had to surrender in May 1943, and this made possible the invasion of Sicily and Italy being knocked out of the war. And in 1943, we see the victor of Malta, this front page dedicated to the new governor of Malta, Lord Gort, who his praised as being the one who led Malta to victory in 1943. So what are the reasons why the Axis failed to neutralize Malta? First of all, there was a lack of strategy and decisive action. Should we invade? Should we not invade? What is going to happen? In the end, the Germans decided that they would not invade Malta, but rather dedicate their resources, their limited resources, to help Rommel in the last throw of dice, in the last major battle, and try to actually conquer Egypt and the Suez Canal, which would open the way to the oil fields in the Middle East. They failed because the British not only withstood this attack, but the British and Commonwealth forces actually won the Battle of El Alamein. Another point is for Hitler, the Mediterranean was of secondary importance in comparison to the Russian front, and therefore the Germans never had enough resources to actually invade Malta and be effective in the Mediterranean. If we take Malta's war in numbers, we see that 30,000 dwellings were damaged or destroyed. There were 3,340 air raids. Okay, these are impressive numbers. Over Malta, the Axis lost more than 1,000 aircraft, of which more than one-fourth were destroyed by the anti-aircraft guns. And in fact, in March and April 1942, at one time, there were days where we had no fighter aircraft available to defend Malta, but only the guns could defend Malta. And this is to the credit of the anti-aircraft gunners in Malta, which were mostly Maltese, of the Royal Malta Artillery. So now to conclude, what are the myths surrounding Malta in the Second World War? 75 years have elapsed. Few people are still alive remembering those days. Unfortunately, as time goes by, this number becomes even smaller. So what is the collective memory of Malta during the Second World War? And here we have a few myths, and we try to see whether they are true or false. The myth that the Italians were cowards and dropped the bombs in the sea, this is totally false. Even the British themselves praised the Italians for their courage. And in fact, the Italians proved more than once that they were not cowards, but they did not have the right tools to do the job. In fact, their weapons were not up to standard to the British, and as we've seen, Italy was not prepared in industrial terms to sustain a long-term war. The Germans, yes, were efficient and ruthless, and Malta was crucial in the war in the Mediterranean. Other myths: many Maltese were fascists and supported Italy. This is only partially true. Even those who were pro-Italians, they were not fascist, but only liked Italian culture. They appreciated Italian culture, and in fact, history tells us that these appreciated Italian culture from the times before Mussolini came to power, and before Mussolini came to power in Italy there were liberal democratic governments, and even at the time these Maltese were pro-Italians. They're pro-Italians of a democratic government. Malta was the most heavily bombed place on earth. This is very true. Malta received more bombs than Britain. In June 1940, Malta was defended by just 3 obsolete Gladiator biplanes. Yes, this is true. That was the sorry state of what was the situation. Malta didn't have one single modern fighter aircraft. And for a few days, we had only just 3 obsolete Gladiator biplanes to defend ourselves from the Italian bombers and freighters. The British government was wrong in interning and deporting the Maltese pro-Italian supporters. This is open to interpretation, but the Maltese courts said that the government in Malta had no right to take these Maltese from Malta to Africa. They could not be deported, and in fact no charges were ever brought against these Maltese, but they were just interned during the war. And the last myth, the Santa Maria convoy in August 1942 saved Malta from surrendering. Yes, it is partly true. It gave us more breathing space, but the convoy in November 1942 actually lifted the siege because it brought enough food and fuel for Malta to continue resisting and actually contribute for the Allied success in Northern Africa. So this was very briefly Malta's role during the Second World War. I hope that you liked this online lecture, especially the part where I have tried through my research to do some myth busting and put this very important part of Maltese history into perspective. It is a very important episode in our history. Just remember that after the war, we embarked on our road to independence, to become a sovereign state, but we should remember the sacrifice made by the Maltese during these terrible days. Thank you.